all three of the individuals on the stage here have a significant part to play within this Foresight realm. And Mike Foley, CEO of Zurich Insurance, he's laughing because he knows why I was doing that, because he has foresight and pays attention. And Laura Naramore from MITRE, which is a large consulting entity, works a lot with the U.S. government and other entities about many things, but in particular as well, foresight about where the future might be going so we can prepare war games and things like this. And of course, Amy Walter, who is with us this morning, those of you who were in the pre-session. Amy's a national editor for Cook. And one of the things I love about Amy is that she gets called by CNN, Fox, MSNBC, BBC, and PBS. There probably aren't many people who get positive calls from all of those entities. So with this, what I'd like to start with is I've asked each of the panelists to give us a sense for what foresight means in your environment. So Mike, do you want to start? What foresight means in the environment of a large global insurer?
Sure. So just to frame for Zurich Insurance, so we do business in more than 170 countries around the world. We have 57,000 employees. We have $67 billion of annual premium, $200 billion of assets under management. So foresight for us covers lots of different areas. To touch it at a high level, there's underwriting risk, which is what people typically think about. We help our customers understand and protect themselves from risk. So how do we think about risks that are coming out that we need to get people prepared for? Just to give a sense of scale, we're still paying claims from the 1960s and 70s for workers' compensation claims, right? So we have very long tails to our risk, and in fact, many of our product lines, it takes 3 or 4 years before we know whether they're actually profitable, because it takes time for people to file the claims and for us to adjudicate them. In North America, I'm talking about, where in North America, what I lead, it's $16 billion of premium. We're the 5th largest commercial insurer in the U.S., and we do commercial insurance, so any type of corporate insurance you could think about. So there's all the underwriting risk, but then you may not think about the operational risk that we have, because one thing our customers definitely expect is the day after the hurricane that they call Zurich and we answer the phone and we actually can get claims professionals there to help them, and that they feel like they're being appropriately cared for. And so there was a great image of people leaving a storm and then the insurers going into the storm, right? Because we have to have our people just outside of the fringe of the impact so we can get up and running the next day. So thinking about operational risk and what all that means is also critical. And then on the investment side, with $200 billion of investments, that we're trying to make sure we have the capital and the cash to pay our customers' claims and help them when they need it. We have issues like what happens if the EU breaks up, or with Brexit, and those have issues about how we think about investing our funds over time. So lots of different things we can dive deep on, but and then also I would just say strategic risk. Our entire operating model is under attack from fintech and from insurtech,
right.
And so lots of different people trying to get into insurance. They don't realize it's a little bit like the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out. Because,
what do you mean by that?
Well, it's a long tail on capital and risk. So if you come into it, you have to be there to handle the claims for a long period of time. So it's not an easy thing to just come into and make a small investment and step out the following year. People are looking for continuity, and Zurich has been in business for over 140 years globally and over 100 years in the U.S. That's the type of stability that our customers look for. And then one last thing is we're AA rated. We calibrate our risk-based capital to the 1 in 2,000 year event. We want to make sure that we can be there to withstand the 1 in 2,000 year event, right? So that's like the Great Flood, right? That's a long time, right? So really trying to think about having enough wherewithal to withstand whatever shock can hit our system. So foresight's a critical topic for us.
So quickly to digress, the catastrophic events, some people are saying there's more volatility, they're happening perhaps more often. Is that what you're seeing in the industry? Are these kinds of unexpected or long tail events happening more often?
Yeah, they're not unexpected, right? Because we know that hurricanes happen and floods happen. And in fact, if you think just last year for Hurricane Matthew that came up along the coast of Florida, but ended up not really being a direct hit, right? If that had been a direct hit on Florida, it would have been $40 to $50 billion of damage for the state of Florida. It was much smaller. So we see these things that are happening. I would say people tend to ignore them, right? They don't really, so we're still building lots of homes in Miami, and people love to live in a Corona commercial. They just don't want to actually take the risk associated with that, right?
So we'll come back to risk behavior and all of that. So Laura, MITRE, what does foresight mean in your environment?
Sure. I feel like the tiny little mouse after the large elephant. MITRE is an operator of federally funded research and development centers. We operate 7 of them. Our longest standing relationship is with the Department of Defense. And our mission is to work in the public interest to advance national security, safety, and stability. So we are scientists emerging out of the Vannevar Bush 1945 monograph about the endless frontier of science,
Yes.
and how it was a national resource critical to our national security and to our economic productivity. So Foresight for us is about using systems engineering techniques, the notion of systems thinking, the idea of context as equally important to capability, to make sure that the government is successful, again, in these long tail investments that the government has to make, not only in basic research and applied research, but in bringing together all of the capabilities that emerge quickly in the commercial sector so that we enhance the capability in near real time for our Department of Defense and many of our civilian agencies.
So how much, I'm curious about a place like MITRE, how much is it that the government agencies are asking you for the foresight? And how much is it that they're asking you to help them generate foresight? What's the mix?
The mix. There are certainly individuals and agencies within government that have the luxury and the time frame to engage in deep thinking about the future.
Sure.
As systems engineers, primarily, that's what we are known for, although we have a lot of the component science and technology specialties within that. We get brought in to think about, most typically, get brought in to think about how to bring a vision to life in the most cost-effective and timely, reliable way possible. That's different than thinking about or advising on the development of long-term mission strategies, but it is integral to the development of capability strategies and impact strategies. Does that help?
Great, yeah. So there are methodologies for transitioning a vision into reality, which of course requires some foresight in order to do that well.
It requires foresight not in the linear sense, but in the horizontal sense.
What do you mean by linear as opposed to horizontal?
Foresight to me often implies an ability to see in the distance down a particular path. And that's where we see not only a lot of government programs, but as a strategist myself, we see a lot of people sort of locking in on a particular approach without designing in, with apologies to the prior speaker, designing in the flexibility to understand that a variety of different currents and cross currents will actually need to be navigated in any system implementation.
Great, thank you. Amy, a political commentator par excellence, what does foresight mean in your environment?
I love that Laura used the term cross currents because I feel like that is mostly what I get to deal with. You know, I live in a 2-year cycle, and so you're constantly struggling with learning lessons from the previous election, trying not to overlearn them, which many of us, I think, in the business do. We fight that last campaign rather than looking ahead to what could be going on in the 2018 or 2020 or 24. And recognizing, too, that all the data points and all the trend lines that we use to help us make some sense of where we think politics will be, where we think the campaigns will be, where the candidates, the issues will be in the future, that those trend lines aren't only going in one direction. We sometimes fall in love with one trend line that is here, and we're not paying attention to the other trends and the other forces that are coming from other places. And I talked about it this morning, but we really fell in love with, I know that I did, and many of my colleagues, and folks on of all political persuasions, into the demographic changes going on in the country and the impact that's been having on voting behavior, which is really important. But that is just one trend. And I think we put a whole lot of emphasis on one trend rather than recognizing that there are multiple trends going on at the same time. And ultimately, politics is messy, all right? It is a very emotional process. We don't think about voting as emotional, but it really is. And I think we don't appreciate enough the cognitive dissonance that goes into the mind of each and every voter, that you're giving them two choices, okay? This is not like marketing a product where if you want to drink Pepsi today and Coke tomorrow, you can do that, okay? You can't do that in voting. You gotta make one choice.
Or no choice at all.
Or no choice at all.
A choice.
That's exactly right. So that makes understanding behavior much more complicated, because we want to look for a scientific answer to something that is much more complicated.
Well, I'd like to dig into this a little bit, not too much. This will not become a political panel, but you are one of the people that people go to understand what's going on, and in this case, what happened. So let's address the Trump-offended in the room a little bit, and then we'll move on. And what happened last year? What happened in terms of prognostications, predictions, forecasts, and while we were Zoomed? What happened?
Yeah, so without getting too deep into the weeds or making this, because this could be a 15-hour, everybody get comfortable, pull on in, I got a pillow.
Well, in our nice steel case chairs, we are very comfortable.
Right.
Yes.
Rings in. I think at its core, people were mistaking polling for predicting, and that if it was number one. I think the prediction models have actually been one of the biggest challenges to our business, because what they led people to believe is that there was some certainty in the data that we had, right? And that you could take a whole bunch of data points, which is polling, and put them into a model and tell us there is an X% chance that this outcome was going to happen. So if you looked at all those prediction models, there's an 89% chance, there's a 79% chance that Hillary Clinton's going to get elected. Now, intellectually, you know that means there's a certain percent chance that Donald Trump will win, but it is a much smaller percentage chance. But as humans, that we don't focus on the small, we focus on the big. If you tell me there's an 85% chance of it raining, I am carrying an umbrella, okay? I'm pretty much sure it's gonna rain. And those, I think, helped to mask some of the underlying challenges for Hillary Clinton in the states like, specifically, Pennsylvania, and as well as some of those other states that broke in a way that none of us saw, and the polling didn't pick up, Wisconsin and Michigan. But the overall data presented a very, very close race. Hillary Clinton was going to win the national election by 1 to 3 points, which was correct. Yeah. The national poll said she's going to win by between 1 and 3 points. It was 2.5 points. Spot on. Nothing wrong with that. The state polls were not correct. We can dig into a whole bunch of reasons for that, but a part of it is the quality of the polling in those states, much different. You don't have the high caliber of polling as you do in some other states. And the pollsters, I think, are going to really have to grapple with whether this suggests there are things that they're missing as they're putting together the polls. But at the end of the day, I think we have to come back to this. This was a very close race where you had a winner of a popular vote and a winner of the Electoral College, which is a rare event. I know it's happened twice in our recent memory, but that still is a pretty rare event. You had two of the most unpopular people in the history of American politics running against each other. You literally had 15 to 20% of Americans telling pollsters, I hate both of them, I wish I didn't have to pick. And they did, right? That is unique. And that it was decided by the tiniest of margins in 3 states. That's not something that we can necessarily replicate. So my challenge now is to look at what happened in 2016, learn the lessons from what we missed or what was underreported or what, learn some of the lessons from that while not over-learning it.
Right.
And now swinging the pendulum all the way the other way.
So let's focus on that for a second. What's going to be different going forward for someone in your role, your profession?
Right.
What are a couple things you're saying we need to do this differently?
Well, I do think we really need to get rid of that whole prediction model thing and just go back to the actual polls. If you said to me, I'm going to tell you these are the data points. In Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton is ahead. She was ahead by 5, now it's by 2 points, right? Here's where the trend line is going. You would say, boy, that's really close.
So you agree with Charles Barkley then?
That the analytics.
Yeah, right, yeah.
No, I think that, what we do in the Cook Political Report is a little bit like, and I can't remember who said this earlier, somebody talking about Theo Epstein and the Cubs, which is, you have to do both of those things together, which is, there's a reason why, even though in baseball it's all about sabermetrics and the data, they haven't gotten rid of baseball scouts. They still send those guys out there to the minors and to high school baseball tournaments to go find that talent, because there is a distinctly human piece of a game that you can't just make about data. And that's what we do as well, which you got to take the data and marry it to, 1, your own common sense, 2, your experience in being through election after election after election, as we have, 3, understanding the fundamentals that make up campaigns and elections. Those don't change, even as the demographics and other things in our world change. There's still some fundamentals that are important to follow. And to appreciate that the human interaction, talking to people, sitting in and getting information from voters, that was a big disconnect. And you heard about it a lot on the Clinton campaign, where the team was so focused on their analytics. It was all about analytics. They learned that from the Obama campaign, that when they would get information from humans saying, I think we have some problems.
Right.
I don't think Michigan's going so well. We're having some disconnect here in Wisconsin.
But
They said,
my
but the
data say-"
analytics say we're fine.
Right.
We don't need to send Hillary Clinton to Wisconsin. Now, to be fair, Wisconsin and Michigan, losing those wasn't the problem. Losing Pennsylvania was the problem. And they did spend a great deal of time and energy and money there. But when they lost Pennsylvania and Florida, that's what tipped the election.
And by the way, I will say, and then Mike, I'll hand it to you, how does Zurich generate foresight with your clients? I mean, what does that look like? But to your great defense, we were together the first time, I think, in September or so last year at the Hotel Jefferson. So maybe it was October. And so it was somewhat before the election. And you I can't say that you predicted, Donald Trump's going to win. But you said something interesting. You said, there's a possibility, but the only way he's going to win, I believe, is if he wins Pennsylvania. And that turned out to be true,
Right.
in a sense. I also have to say about it, and then we'll move out of the realm of politics. I have a lot of friends and family all over this great country, and in New York and San Francisco, Chicago, but also Idaho and Iowa and East Tennessee. And I'm connected with many of them on Facebook. And I was seeing vastly different perspectives coming from, and in fact, what was weird about it was you could take one email rant and replace the word Clinton with Trump, and it almost read accurately, because they were just throwing stuff at each other, past each other. So we really did have these echo chambers we were in. And so I certainly didn't believe that Donald Trump was going to win, that I was a little bit unsure about my confidence.
Right.
Mike.
So can I defend data? Is that
Please, defend data.
Yeah, no, I'm
As the other male on the defend data.
As the insurer in the group, right? So, and then I'll come back to people as well. So, so look, one of the ways that we generate data is we have big data lakes, and we do big data and whatever that means, right? We do generalized linear models, and we have all sorts of data, and you get more and more every day now, right? And so we have this question of what's better, data or humans, right? And so we brought our best underwriters in, and we asked them what they looked for when they looked for a good or a bad risk. And we did it for property and liability and workers' compensation. And so in a property risk, maybe you look for, are there sprinklers and are there smoke alarms? And Is it in a relatively high or low area or a flood zone? And are there fasteners holding the roof down or not? There's a bunch of stuff you can look at, right? And so they did their list, and about 2/3 of the time, almost no matter what line of business, about 2/3 of the time, the underwriters had accurate things that they were looking for. And about 1/3 of the time, the things they looked for either weren't correlated or actually counterpredictive to what they thought it would be. Gee, I thought that would be a good thing, but it's not, right? So now, as humans, you know, and with a delayed feedback loop, because our claims take at least a year or two to work through, and sometimes often longer, right? So if you're right 2/3 of the time, you feel pretty good, right? Because you sort of have a confirmation bias, and you look and you're like, I know exactly what I'm doing, because I remember I looked that had sprinklers, and it actually was it didn't have a big claim, right? So but when you back test it with the data, you can see where you're wrong, right? And now, of course, the flip side is if you become model blind and use data as the only answer, that doesn't work either, right? And so we've seen that in lots of places. Even if you looked at Hurricane Katrina, which is the worst hurricane that we've had in terms of dollars of loss, the real issue there was a failure of infrastructure, that the levees broke. There was a big hurricane, but the models didn't plan on the levees breaking, right? But when you marry the two together, you get the best answer, and that's why I've been saying it's person with machine. Sounds better, man with machine, but we have to be diverse and correct here. So it's person with machine that makes a better outcome, because there's some things that data is better at, and people convince themselves the wrong way. So most of our large losses happen with a customer who hasn't had a loss for the last 5 years. So when you're talking to the customer, you say, I have a very safe operation, everything's fine, and then something big and tragic happens, right? And they just don't have the ability to intuit that coming, right? And so you need data to support it, but you can't just use data, because people can still discern things that you can't get in off a data lake, right? So it's the two together.
And this is a question for all of you. As the data and the analytics get better, as they span more potential horizontals, will we get to a point where we can increasingly rely on technology, automation, et cetera, to do a lot of these calculations to make us more effective than your 66% humans? Anyone want to tackle that? If Peter Diamandis were on the panel, he'd say yes, and we're all out of a job in 10 years.
Right. So I'll take the bait on that one. As you asked it, yes, of course, eventually, sometime down the road, we're going to have, this machine age, this fourth industrial age, where we have perfected algorithms that know the best answer, both before and in greater depth than a human would. But I'm on the skeptic side of the argument, so I'll take the counter data argument and stick with the human side of the argument, which is what we're seeing right now is that data analysis is in and of itself, through coding, fundamentally human. So all we're doing is encoding the human biases in the way that we interpret the data and not only draw conclusions from it, but even structure it. So there are, it's like living on a fault line. There are inherent structural complexities that I think may be a bit of a headwind to fully replacing all of your employees with.
I never said I wanted to do that. I just said people and
You're gonna do both, right?
You're
Do both.
screaming.
He said that.
Do that, right.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, Amy, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's
Because you do both all the
right.
time.
Right. I think you have to constantly calibrate that. And
Any
look,
advice
our
for-
voting behavior.
Any advice for balancing or calibrating that?
I don't know that I have tremendous advice except for to constantly challenge your assumptions about why do you think that is the case. So this is the frustration that my colleagues and I had on the question of Pennsylvania. I wrote about it 2 years before the election. I said, this to me is the tipping point state. It's a state, if they look at the data, it's the one state in the quote-unquote blue wall that has been states that Democrats have won every year for president since 1992, that have been trending more Republican. I said, this is a place, if I were a Republican, I would go after Pennsylvania. And when we asked Democrats to refute why this wasn't the case, right? They'd say, that's ridiculous, they can never win. Why can't they ever win? Well, no Republicans ever won there since 1984. Well, that's not a reason for why they can't win it in the future. It's never happened, so of course it can't happen. And then of course they would get in the data about the suburbs of Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia outweighs but they were, you know, so you do have to constantly question assumptions about politics. But the other thing that's happening in politics too is our own behavior. I'm glad you pointed out the Facebook thing. We have become more insulated and isolated now. We live in our echo chambers more and more. And what psychiatrists will tell you, or behaviorists will tell you, is, you know, the more that you're around like-minded people, the more extreme you get in your own positions. Even if you went in sort of moderately on one side or the other, you become more extreme when you're surrounded by like-minded people. So that's happening more and more. And we find voters now behaving, we behave more like a parliamentary system where fewer and fewer people are splitting their tickets. There was a time when you would have voters vote for the president of one party, and they say, well, I don't really like Republicans, but I like my congressman who's a Republican, but I never vote for a Republican for president, or vice versa. Well, now we see it's 3%, 5% split ticket voting at the House. The Senate level in this last election, there was not one Senate candidate from the opposite party who won a state that their party did not win. In other words, there was no split ticket voting on the Senate side either. That has made it much more difficult then for candidates who want to try to find that elusive middle.
Right.
To find that, because really now we have these two poles, and the elections are about how do you get your side more motivated and hope that the other side is more passive.
And that seems like a dangerous place for the
right, if you want to think about where the country goes, if you have these two poles and all they're doing is changing by this much, right, the votes being this close every election between who's more motivated and who's less motivated, and very few people willing to cross over.
Laura, MITRE working with the DoD and others, you mentioned that some of them have the luxury and capability to look very far out, and they need to. Give us some idea, some advice regarding translating Foresight, big long-term program, very expensive, high risk in some cases, into action. What are some insights that MITRE can provide about what works and what doesn't work?
Pass. No.
Say again. Pass?
Right,
Oh, okay. Pass.
I can tell you, but I'm
Right,
not going to kill you. I say it's deeply classified.
Yeah,
exactly. Can't talk.
I'll pick up where you left off on this polarization and the shifts, right?
Yeah.
So that the way that the U.S. government model is structured, funding priorities move in concert with political priorities. It used to be after World War II, really through the late 70s, that there was a centrist government and a universal, I guess lowercase u, universal value for science and technology, both as an economic engine and as a national defense engine. In those times, it was possible and incredibly productive to have long-term, high manpower developmental projects. So you'd have a team of 50, 150 men and women working for those of you who saw Hidden Figures, working for years to develop and deploy a capability. And that included iterations and tests. I think really over the past 20 years and intensely over the past 10 or 12 years, the political gyrations are so fast that you don't have the same, fewer and fewer people have the luxury to engage in foresight simply because of the way that their budgets work. And they can't fund things over multiple budget cycles. And development follows cash flow. No margin, no mission. So I think it's quite sad. It makes me feel very sad that science has become a commodity purchase rather than this sort of, I'll say, lust for development that used to exist across both parties. So in short, we don't often get to give long cycle foresight advice and counsel because no one really has the luxury to do that
And
anymore.
so these public dynamics and the churn of politics, or rather the polarization in a sense, is affecting very much America's ability, and this would apply to any other country where these dynamics might be relevant, to look further out, to prepare for the future, to create a big vision and go to the moon.
In my opinion, yes, and I'll give you a specific, an example that's very close to MITRE's heart. The federally funded research and development centers are described in the legislation that created them and in the federal acquisition regulations that govern them as long-term relationships for special purposes to develop capabilities that government can't fully own and control and understand for themselves. It used to be that the federally funded, the FFRDC contract was a 20-year proposition. Many of them many of the same sponsors are the ones. Air Force has been with MITRE since 1958. But over the past 5 years, the acquisition community within the federal government has been, that we're seeing an accelerated trend of recompeting FFRDCs for lowest cost, technically acceptable providers. So the shift in emphasis towards cost effectiveness from a government as consumer perspective is influencing science and applied research just as much as these budget swings are.
So a couple things I don't want: the lowest cost science visionary and the lowest cost insurance provider. I don't want those. Mike, back to, I imagine you agree with me on that.
I do.
But let's talk briefly about the human side here, because I've gotten to know you and your company the past few years, and the huge challenges in the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, and a number of years ago, after helping to, it's still really being involved, your company made an additional commitment there, a significant commitment to the Gulf Coast. What's something that your team perhaps have learned about, you mentioned this before, people don't think about this stuff as much as they should. What's something perhaps that surprised you, or something you've learned about applying Foresight and navigating the ecosystem of players you need to navigate to help make this stuff work properly?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's a good thing that everyone has a very sort of positive spirit and doesn't tend to think about the negative side of things, I think, right? By the way, Rob was alluding to the fact that we were down in New Orleans and we started connecting to that community just before Katrina hit, and then Katrina hit and we had a decision to pull out of a major golf tournament that we sponsor there or not, and we decided to double down and help New Orleans rebuild and be part of that community, which has been
do
great.
Far more than the golf tournament.
Yeah, which has been great for us and great for the community. It's worked out really well, and as part of that, that actually led Zurich to think about a global initiative on flood resilience, because we looked at the impact of Katrina and other parts around the world where there's 250 million people a year affected by flood somewhere in some way. A lot of it's not insured or not adequately insured, and so we've spent tens of millions of dollars to partner with other organizations to just make people more aware of that. But it's interesting, just if I go not from sort of natural catastrophes to even like to cyber events, right? So everyone worries about cyber, right? You're all probably worried about it in some way. Everyone thinks you're going to be hacked, right? What's still the most popular password in the world is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right?
And the second most popular is
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right?
Oh, okay, all right.
And then password is the
Last
sixth.
password.
It's the sixth. That's gone down in value, right? So, but it turns out that if you have a password that has 6 characters and has only letters and numbers, it can be cracked by a computer in less than a second, right? If you have a password that has 10 characters and it has only letters and numbers, it can be cracked very quickly, a couple hours. To get a password that's actually strong enough, you need letters, numbers, caps, and small letters, and then also special symbols, right? So 10 characters, if you did that with that permutation, it would take 54 years for a computer to break it, right? How many people have a 10-character password that has all those components in it? That's pretty good, okay. But a lot don't, right? So we have all these things that are, we talk about foresight, how there's these huge things way out there that we have to worry about, but there's things right here that we could worry about, that we could get better at. We still have people flooding to cat-prone areas. We still have all these things that we just know are high risk, and we still do them, right? So then we think about how to think about all the futures and then go future back and think about which ones we're going to deal with. It's pretty challenging, right, to think about getting people to get that focused on it. I would say though, we won't be able to be perfect in our foresight. So another big push for us is resilience, just realizing that you're going to get the future wrong somewhere, right? And so at least for Zurich, we think we didn't get to be 140 years providing insurance by picking one bet and going with it. You have to hedge your bets and leave some options open. That does sometimes make you seem like not the coolest kid in the room, right? Because the person who picked the one future and
Yes.
put all their chips on that future can actually, if that comes out, be really seen as insightful, sort of looking backwards, right? There's probably 999 other people who picked a different future who didn't have that outcome, right? But so I would have a pitch for resilience and trying to think about, while we look at the future and try to move towards it in positive ways, just kind of hedging our bets and realizing that we should build in resilience into all of our business models.
So we're coming down to the conclusion, but I have one last question for each of you. It's some hindsight foresight. Briefly, what was the factor that led you in the direction of your career? And I know it's a difficult question to answer briefly, but this is Kellogg, so you're going to have to do your best. Briefly, what is the factor that most led you in this direction of your career? Amy, you look deep in thought.
Oh, gosh. Hating everything else that I'd tried before then.
That's a good reason.
But actually it is. I tell that to young people that I meet all the time is, you're lucky if you find something that you really love to do. And mostly you get there by doing a lot of things that you hated up until that point. And so to look through, I go through all the things that I did before I got this job. They were important, but I think being able to check off things that I didn't want to do was as important as finding the thing that I wanted to do.
Great. Love. Laura.
Huge egos, even bigger talent, and this driving sort of personal mission to change the world that motivates the scientists and engineers that I've worked with for my whole career. The ability to help them articulate what it is that they want to accomplish and sort of, instrument the voice is, I wouldn't change a single step that I've taken.
You bring some of the discipline to the passion and to help
Yes.
make it happen. Mike.
I'm a Kellogg graduate, so I'm not sure you're going to like my answer. But
All right.
so as a math and economics undergrad, had a number of paths in my career. Actively avoided insurance, and actually, I think I met someone in the audience who's from another insurance company, is an actuary. Out of undergrad, actuarial was one of the paths I looked at, and I said, "Don't want that. This is a really boring industry." Right. And then I was at McKinsey and doing sort of industrial consulting, loved it, and I needed an in-town client, which wasn't Zurich, by the way. So I just got an in-town client. The interesting thing is, once I got into insurance, I realized it's the most fascinating industry that I've ever been in, because it's connected to everything that happens in the economy, right? We insure every company and every type of risk. And so it went from seeming really boring from the outside to being really exciting on the inside. Real problem for insurance in general and our war for talent, because we still have a bit of a cachet of being the sleepy industry, but I'll do a quick pitch that if you ever step into it, you'll find it's really exciting and interesting. But it was a little bit by accident, but happy that I got there.
Great. And much of life is by accidents, Mike. We have the vision to actually take advantage of them. Risks people don't often think about. What's better, data or humans? The question is an odd one in itself. Cross currents, Laura and Amy, are we paying attention to those cross currents and constantly challenging our assumptions? And are we model blind in that encoding our human biases, Laura? Are we looking linearly as well as horizontally? And what does that mean? It's a moving target. I love, Laura, that you started by mentioning Vannevar Bush, a gentleman whom Moran Cerf and I mentioned in our book, wrote a piece called As We May Think in 1945. And in this piece, he basically articulated hypertext, fundamental insights into our present-day world. Thank you very much for your insight and foresight.